I'm from My Society, which is an increasingly international but originally British charity that runs websites that help people do things like get potholes fixed and get messages sent to their local politicians and get important information out of bits of government. But this morning, I'm actually mainly here to talk about what we do and the way it isn't new, and to help you see what we're doing and other people here are doing, see it in a historical context. So, as we all talk about Facebook and Twitter, it's easy to forget a basic and pretty much timeless fact, which is people who have succeeded in changing the world in the past have often, if not always, been good or even masters at the communications and information technologies of those times, whenever those times were and whatever the technologies were. And the goal of my talk is to make you, as change makers, to see digital technologies not as something new and strange, but just as the latest in a long line of tools for storing and sharing and making information powerful, tools which, when used wisely, can help create real-world, long-lasting impacts. And I will argue, or try and persuade you, that being good at using these tools is not a matter of being trendy and cutting edge. It's just a matter of being willing to go through the same learning curve that historical change makers that we all admire went through themselves in their own days. So this is a Gutenberg Bible, one of only 21 remaining copies of the first printed book in the Western world. It's not in English. There's another printed Bible, the Tyndale Bible, that is in English. Now, the Tyndale Bible was not the first translation of the Bible into English. The activity of translating bits of the Bible had been going on into English for 700 years before this. But it was the first to be printed and the first to be distributed in large numbers. And it was in 1526 that Tyndale did produce his first English New Testament. And it was only 5 years later that Henry VIII passed the first of a series of laws that led to the creation of the Church of England and the breakaway from the Catholic Church in Britain, one of the great societal changes in British history. Now, clearly, there were many other factors at play here, but it's worth noting that Tyndale's effect was seen as significant enough that he was paid the compliment of being strangled and then burnt at the stake. An early lesson there in the price of being too good at using a new medium for political purposes. His skillful use of the current technology, printing, cost him his life, but also assured his place in British history. Now, in the late 18th century, Britain went through another great upheaval, the slow building of a consensus that the incredibly lucrative slave trade was a moral crime that had no parallel dimensions. There were many people involved in this campaign. It lasted decades. There were many pamphlets, rallies, and of course huge uprisings before anything happened. But one of the key moments in the campaign, two key moments happened when the campaigners used information in a way that hadn't really been used before. The first was when printed illustrations were produced showing in grim detail the incredible numbers of people crammed inhumanely into the holds of slave ships, memorable kind of visceral images. And the second, which was about building sort of domestic support, was that the campaigners went to various ports. They wrote down the names of all the white British sailors who went to sea as part of the quote-unquote lucrative slave trade, and then wrote down the enormously smaller number that came back again, and made the point that maybe this wasn't quite as profitable as had been thought, because there was a moral and an economic dimension to this great campaign. Now, using these unforgettable, grisly diagrams and these statistics, the campaigners won many new converts for whom the stories and the narratives and even the plays that had been around for years had not been enough to convince. The campaigners in that campaign understood that words and images printed in bulk, printed in the right way and distributed could be a potent weapon for changing minds, more potent than the pamphlets and the more traditional campaigning of their opponents. And so the abolitionists had not only the obvious moral force of history on their side, they had a better understanding of the outer limits of how much emotional punch could be packed into ink and paper than their opponents. And talking about outrage, one of my formative memories is this. The early 1980s coverage of the famine in Ethiopia. This image was brought into my house in Oxford, where I grew up, not a million miles away from where Mr. Tyndale met his end. And this is a picture of Michael Burke holding a poor, kind of starving child, and it was broadcast by the BBC in a series of broadcasts. And what Burke did specifically there is he used the technology of the time, widely adopted colour television, cameras that could be carried into the field, broadcast mechanisms that could send things back from the country, and made it into a series of images and messages that completely changed the importance of East African famine in the minds of British people as an enormous group. And again, just with Tyndale and with the abolitionists, he took the information technologies of the day and used them powerfully to change people's minds. And it carries on. It seems that the people of Bahrain are not too happy with their current rulers. Now, what they've done here is pretty simple for the 21st century, but unimaginable for the previous things I showed you, even the 1980s. They've taken a free satellite photo off Google Maps. Any of us can go and get this who have a computer. They've worked out that that box to the left is one person's house from the ruling family, and that box that is half the size to the right is the entire nearby village where everybody else lives. The case is made in a new form. These people are not incredible experts. They just took the medium of the time, they used it, and as we all know, there is now a great movement in Bahrain. So I've drawn together these 4 examples that underline one simple message, that people who are good at changing the world often invest the time and energy to become good at these information technologies of the day in question, even if they don't care about technology and they don't care about information. But I've given a very partial picture here because I've only talked about information used to change hearts and minds, not information that's used to give people tools. And this is a history in its own right. So William Cobbett produced the first English grammar for normal, non-kind of rich aristocratic people in 1818. And it was not a book designed to change minds. It was a tool to empower people with no formal education to have the English skills required to help them thrive and ultimately succeed in the Industrial Revolution. For a different thing, in 1922, the BBC made the first radio weather broadcasts, which became an indispensable tool for improving the safety and the yields of people working at sea and in agriculture on the land. And these are examples of information as tools and not as campaigning. And these things are more like what my society does. Our goal is to build tools that are aimed at giving people power who don't believe that they have any or that they can have any. We're not actually an activism group. We don't teach people about the merits of participating in their democracy. Instead, we use the medium of the current day, which is now the internet, to give people answers and tools to help them solve problems when they sit down in front of a computer with a real problem. How do I get that abandoned car removed from outside my house? How do I tell the local politician that I'm not happy about something? How do I find how much money the government spent on changing something in my community that I don't like? How do I influence that? These are the kinds of questions that Owen was talking about before. We build tools for end users, even though I have a background as a policy wonk, and I love stats and numbers. My society is about these kinds of tools, and so we run Fix My Street, which takes problem reports and routes them to whatever branch of local government in Britain happens to be the right one. You don't have to know who's responsible, it just sends it to the right place. And that's such a simple idea that it's been copied in many other countries. We run Right to Them, which simply tells people who their elected representatives are at different levels and lets them send them messages. It's not the sexiest stuff in the world, but time and time again we see the same thing, which is that about half of the people using the services tell us, oh, before I did this, I'd never written to a politician before in any way. I'd never reported a problem in any way. And how or why do we manage to attract people like this? Because we focus on people's needs and we give people tools to solve those needs, not what we think their needs might be. And my last comment to draw this together actually comes from George Soros, whose completely fascinating new book I'm reading at the moment about his philanthropy. And he has, of course, funded plenty of activism around the world against some of the world's most difficult and unpleasant governments. But he states in an interesting passage in his book that he always prefers to provide money for services over activism. And his logic is like this. It's very persuasive. He says, if you provide a good service, then you'll always unambiguously help people. If you educate them or if you build some facility, they will get stuff. Whereas if you just pay for activism, it's possible that you might fail. You might actually run a campaign and never get anything at all. But if you provide facilities, you always win because you've always made someone better educated. You've always fed them or clothed them. But there is also a chance that as you educate them and as you give them facilities, you will change their expectations about how the world can change. You can empower them to demand change by giving them, the tool, whether the tool is education, whether the tool is something much kind of simpler, like a tool to write to their politician. You can both serve their need and you can change their worldview. And where My Society fits in this grand historical novel as a tiny little cog at the end is that we're trying to do that because if you believe you can force your local government to fix a street light, if you believe that when you didn't believe it before, you're that much more likely to believe that maybe you can get your government to turn around your country. And that's what My Society is about. And I'm running a table upstairs if you want to know more. So thank you very much.